Such theories, built on the range of diverse figures described above, have recently come under attack. Perry, 1987, O'Hanlon, 1988. For ignoring the fragmentary and conflictual nature of the discourses of power, different places and spaces, of course, for ignoring the heterogeneity of power and apparently reducing it to discourses of representation and ignoring its material realities, for ignoring the positivity of the subaltern as the professor of other knowledges and traditions, as having their own history in which there are power relations defined within the ranks of the subordinated. And one might add yet another problem concerning the status of the marginal and subordinate in these figures. On what grounds do we assume that a privileged or even different structure of subjectivity belongs to the subaltern? As if, as Hall suggests, the marginal has become central. It is not descriptive of the contemporary subject. The other side of the question is, can one form of subordination become the models of all structural domination? Insofar as we have now created a figure of the subaltern, have we not developed another universalizing theory, providing answers to any local struggle before we have even begun? Since we know we will always find the production of the other as different. Cultural identity and the logic of difference. But as I have said, I want to contest such theories of identity on broader grounds, namely that they have failed to open up a space of anti or even counter-modernity. In other words, they are ultimately unable to contest the formations of modern power on their deepest levels because they remain within the strategic forms of modern logic, difference, individuality, and temporality. It will begin by considering the nature of the logic of difference, which offers a particular interpretation of the relation between identity and modernity, an interpretation which, by its very logic, denies the possibility of any alternative which might escape its logic. The logic of modern. Since the modern constitutes its own identity by differentiating itself from an other, usually tradition as a temporal other, or spatial others transformed into temporal others. Identity is always constituted out of difference. The modern makes identities into social constructions, and thus a counter-modern politics has to contest the particular relations of identity and difference, and have been constructed by, offered and taken up in the modern. Here we have no choice but to start with questions of difference, and to explore the nature of difference and its relation to identity. This is certainly the dominant response in cultural studies, but the real question is, to what end? If difference is irrevocable, then modernity is inescapable. If it may seem somewhat ironic that just as we discover that not only particular identities, but identity itself is socially constructed, we organize political struggle within the category of identity around particular socially constructed identities. But there is, of course, an alternative understanding of the relation of the modern and identity, which suggests that the modern transforms all relations of identity into relations of difference. Thus, the modern constitutes not identity, but not identity out of difference, but difference out of identity. The modern never constitutes itself as an identity different from others, but as a difference, always different from itself across time and space. In this sense, the fundamental structures of modernity are always productions of difference. Here the problem is to avoid starting with questions of difference. A counter-modern politics has to elude the logic of difference and to recapture the possibility of a politics of otherness. If the first interpretation condemns itself and every possible counter-strategy to remaining within the moderns, the second attempt to escape the determining boundaries of the modern by seeing the first interpretation as itself an historical product of modern power. Let me attempt to clarify the relation between theories of difference and what I will call theories of otherness. The former are certainly dominant in contemporary theories and are built upon a very strong notion of difference, derived largely from structuralist and post-structuralist theory. That the identity of or meaning of a term depends entirely, except perhaps for a necessary but indeterminate excess, on its relation to its difference from other terms. In fact, theories of difference take difference itself as given, as the economy out of which identities are produced. Theories of otherness, on the other hand, assume that difference is itself an historically produced economy, imposed in modern structures of power of the real. Difference, as much as identity, is an effect of power. While such theories obviously accept a weak notion of difference, A is not B or C or D. They do not see such differences as fundamentally constitutive. Rather, they begin with a strong sense of otherness, which recognizes that the other exists in its own place as what it is independently of any specific relations. But what is indeed not be defined in transcendental or essential terms, that it is can be defined by its particular contextual power, affect and be affected. That is, such views of otherness grant to each term an unspecified but specifiable positivity. After all, modern thought is not just binary, but a particular kind of binary producing machine, where binaries become constitutive differences in which the other is defined by its negativity. As Deleuze and Guattari puts it, 1987, how to think about fragments whose sole relationship is sheer difference fragment that are related to one another only in that each of them is different, without having recourse to any sort of original totality, not even one that has been lost, or to a subsequent totality that may not yet have become about. In more philosophical terms, these alternatives can be located within the argument between Derrida and Foucault. For example, around their differing readings of Descartes, Derrida 1978, Foucault 1979. Derrida argues that Descartes' exclusion of madness from reason itself constituted the possibility and identity of reason. The relation between reason and madness is then an ordinary structure of difference, in the sense that, once again, difference always exists and at the center of identity. And in that sense, for Derrida, Descartes is still alive, since any conception of reason must produce and negate madness. For Foucault, On the other hand, Descartes' exclusion of madness has a philosophical representation of a real historical event. The exclusion was material and special as much as discursive. While this exclusion was necessary to establish the status of reason and to naturalize the identification of reason and subjectivity, it is not itself constitutive either of reason of madness or of madness. Each of these terms has its own positivity or exteriority which can and does affect the other. In that sense, for Foucault, Descartes is irrelevant today. It is not coincidental, of course, that Derrida argues that philosophy can never escape the logocentrism which, it will argue, is constitutive of modernity. Foucault often writes as if he had already done so. Much of the contemporary work of identity can be seen as a struggle taking place in the space between Derrida and Foucault. Thus, for example, Laclau and Mouffet's 1985 influential work, which has contributed significantly to the theoretical frameworks within which cultural studies has approached questions of identity, can be seen as an attempt to bring Foucault and Derrida together with the aid of Gramsci. But what has really happened in that Laclau and Mouffe have reread Foucault as if he were Derrida. Foucault's notion of the regularity of dispersion becomes an ensemble of differential position. The rarity of discourse becomes exteriority as an excess found in the surplus of meaning. And Foucault's concern with subjectivization becomes the centrality of the production of subjects as the basis of the chain of discourse, which produces both temporary fixity and the excess which destabilizes it. Similarly, Edward Said claims to have based much of his work in Orientalism, 1978, on Foucault. As numerous commentators have pointed out, however, the notion of Orientalism is intentionally ambiguous in a way that makes it quite difficult to actually pin down Said's theoretical position. At times, Said seems to suggest that Orientalism is a mode of representation by which we distinguish ourselves from others. But again, as numerous critics have pointed out, this is insufficient for it will seem to condemn any attempt to represent the other. And at another point, Said describes Orientalism as a style of thought based on an ontological and epistemological distinction. But he fails to consider the political history of the relationship between epistemology and ontology. It is that any ontological distinction in an act of power, or is it that when such ontological distinctions are defined by and placed in the service of knowledge, that is, when epistemology is equated with or superseded ontology, Orientalism emerges. Of course, Said actually does being to sound like Foucault when he connects specific discourses and their distribution to the institutions of colonialism itself, where we can see the crucial ambiguity in Said's thesis. An ambiguity which has itself defined by the field of identity theories. To put it rather too simply, the question is, does the Oriental exist apart from Orientalism? While many interpreters have responded in the negative, they have failed to distinguish a number of possible explanations. One possible interpretation of the existence of the Orient is tautological. Since the Orient and the Oriental are constructions of colonial discourses, they cannot exist outside of those discourses. The Orient, as an object of knowledge, is the product of colonial relations of power. But it is just so simple because, as numerous critics have pointed out, if this is the case, then all knowledge and the construction of any object of knowledge must itself be condemned as appropriative and oppressive. It is not the articulation of knowledge into particular geo-economic and political relations that refigures curiosity into power. There are at least three different positions on the existence of the Oriental, which can be laid out along a continuum. The first sees it as pure excess or supplement, as the negativity at the heart of the Occident's own self-understanding. On this view, if it weren't the Orient and the West created, it would have had to have been somewhere else, and obviously it was other places as well. The second position places the Orient and the Orient in an unequal relation of constitutive difference. It is necessary to self-definition of the other. Each defines itself by marking itself as different from the other. But like any theory of constitution, there is a necessary uncertainty at the center. From the fact is that each must exist independently of the relationship in order to be appropriated into the relation, and each must therefore, in some sense, have its own positivity. But this positivity is itself never specified, for it is always deferred, always irrelevant to the constitutive relation itself. The third position will seem to have been said that Orientalism involves actual material processes of colonization, travel, exploitation, and domination. That is, people traveled to places and cultures that already existed. The Oriental, as it were, existed independently of the Orientalism. The act of power comes not in creating something from nothing, but in reducing something to nothing, to pure semantic and differential terms. In negating the positivity of the Arab world with all its diversity, for example, to nothing but a singular constitutive order, to the different. Thus, it is the material side of discursive power, and which is, I will argue, a fundamental logic of formations of modern power. Starting from the last position, said has in the more recent work explicitly attempted to define a practice that both inscribes and transcends cultural identity. As Benita Parry, 1992, and others have pointed out, such a project opens up a series of potentially significant materialist questions about the interdependence of metropolitan and colonial histories and cultures, about the changing modes of Western capitalist penetration into other worlds, about the possibilities of morally representing others, about the relations between power and distinctions, about the specificity of Western structures of power, about the relations between the cultures of imperialism and colonialism, and imperialism, non-discursive or non-cultural dynamics, and about the geopolitical configurations of power and power relations within cultural processes. But instead, the dominant deployment of said has been to establish a simple chain from colonialism to the construction of cultural identities, to the production of subjects, and sometimes the discovery of resistance. Thus, a very different range of questions is raised about how colonialism produces a particular subjectivity of the colonized, or how it closes off the possibility of subjectivity in some combination of the two. As Parry describes it, this involves theorizing the specificities of a polyformic post-colonial condition, understood almost entirely in terms of identity and subjectivity, whether it is assumed to be authentic or not. This use said also raises questions about how post-colonial subjects via cultural production and practices subvert Western colonial authority, usually as it is embodied in cultural forms themselves. Or finally, it can be used to raise questions about the very politics of subjectivity and the search for a subject position for the colonial subject, because subjectivity is only possible in the places constructed by colonizer. In fact, Spivak, 1988, seems to argue that subjectivity is itself a Western category, and that in the colonial relation, the West seeks to construct a subject as its other, that Parry refers to as the subject as the space of imperialist self-consolidation other. What all of these questions have unanswered is the relationship between subjects, identities, and agents, even though each is ultimately interested in the complex intersection of these questions. Instead, they seem content to study the continual struggle of the colonized to resolve the paradoxes which this displacement and dehumanization of indigenous processes of identification sets up in his daily experience. O'Hanlon, 1988.